aging is a very interesting thing, right? We've taken a spirit that I found to be fairly unexpressive, a little bland, a little tart, a little bit sharp, and has turned it into something that is luscious, velvety, really rich, really aromatic, right? And lots of flavors and aromas that we really enjoy, right? That's incredible, right? And we've been doing this with spirits, wine, beer, among other things, for quite some time, right? And like most of drinking history, we don't really have a clear picture of when that may have started, right? People were drinking. You think they're going to sit there writing stuff down? Oh, this is interesting. I should remember this for later. And this is the person's name who came up with it. And this was the year that it happened. No, we don't really know. We know that we know that kind of way back in time, we were storing and aging things in clay or ceramic amphora, these big earthenware jars, right? Which with wine would, I'm sure Rick will touch on this, with wine will allow it to sort of oxidize slowly because it's not an airtight seal, right? And that changed the way that the wine reacted, right? Now, those jars were very heavy. Those jars were very hard to transport. And those jars were incredibly fragile and easy to break. So what did they do? Well, they said, well, we have all these palm trees growing around, so we'll make barrels out of palm wood. And that was around the 5th century BC is when we start seeing evidence of that happening. And by about the 2nd century, we start to see a shift from really hard, really kind of brittle palm wood to oak, which has a special property that when you heat it up, it actually is quite flexible, which is very handy. So they bound these things together into barrels of any number of different sizes, and they would store things in it, right? Now, this worked a lot better than the clay jars, right? A barrel is round. A barrel can be rolled. You can, with the right implements, you can stack them on top of each other. They're quite durable. And if one or a couple pieces of the barrel kind of are falling apart, you can replace it, you can fix it. It was something that had a lot more staying power, right? So we started storing liquids in barrels. And at some point in time, I'm sure they noticed, right, that something was a little different when it came out of that barrel, however long it sat in there. When that happened, we don't know. We do know that Bordeaux wine merchants that were shipping their wine up the river used a slightly smaller cask, 225 liters, right? Yeah. And it was easier to fit on their ships. There was also a tax reason for that, but we won't get into that. And they noticed that the wine coming out on the other end was far superior to what they started with. And now there were some brandy distillers just down the street in Cognac that said, well, hey, we could do that too, right? They were burning their wine into this sort of proto-brandy, right? And they started to barrel age what is now known as Cognac, right? Now, there are a number of different factors, right, that contribute to the oak influence on spirits. Early influence was probably pretty minimal. Why? Because those barrels were used again and again and again and again. And eventually, the oak doesn't really have much more to offer to what's sitting inside it, except for the small amount of air that can get in and out that allows that spirit or wine or beer to evolve and change over time. But fresh oak, there's tons of stuff in fresh oak that can contribute to the way a spirit tastes, right? So you have things like tannins that add bitterness. You have things like acids, like lactones, in American oak especially, that give you sort of vanilla, coconut, a little ginger spice. Things like cocoa and chocolate come out. Lignins in wood affect color and also stimulate the production of vanillins, which also in some ways increases the complexity of what's in there. And then there's also lipids in wood too, these organic fats that add a lot of texture. There's a richness to that bourbon that we tasted, right? They didn't add any sugar to it. They didn't add corn syrup. They didn't add, there's no additives to that, right? That difference in texture is purely from the barrel, which I think is pretty cool. right? Now, aging in oak really only starts to work its wonders after a year or so, right? This is when you start to see some color change. With bourbon and rye whiskeys, you are required 2 years to be able to call it a straight bourbon or a straight rye, which is to some degree some marker of quality, I suppose. And after 4 years, you can drop the age statement entirely, which is a popular thing for bourbon and rye manufacturers to do now. Oftentimes, you'll see some things like, in the past there was Elijah Craig 12-year. It was a blend where the minimum age was 12 years old, right? And then you've seen scotches and some rums and things that go way beyond that, right? After 8 to 12 years is when you start seeing some of these qualities really start to sing. And then when you get past 12 and 15 is when sometimes some magic can really happen, right? Let's pick up number 3. So we're talking about language. We're talking about language around aging. With a lot of whiskeys, we are very concerned with the number, right? Is it 8 years old? Is it 12? Is it 18? Oh, it's 21. That's very good. Or it's I prefer 12s over the 8-year blends, right? With cognacs, it's kind of this nebulous thing. They are very sort of cutesy with their words and have created these nebulous terms that refer to certain age blends, but don't necessarily tell you the whole story, right? In this case, Hors is anything above 10 years, right? You've seen VS, you've seen VSOP, like I think that stands for it's very special, and then very superior old pale, which to the common consumer walking through a liquor store, what does that mean? Absolutely nothing, right? And then there's XO, which at the moment is anything over 6, but eventually it'll be over 10 because they're changing the regulations, and it's this kind of moving target, right? But for them, these cognac producers are not really after particular age statements. What they're after is a particular flavor profile, right? Cognac and bourbon are very similar in certain ways. There are big houses, big producers that produce a lot of different bourbons. What you see on the sheet of paper that went around are the 4 different, well, slightly more than 4, different recipes of Buffalo Trace, right? The distillery that makes its namesake bourbon, among other things, some of which you're probably very familiar with. And we're talking about mash bill number 1, which is where we had that white whiskey, the White Dog, or new make. It's what it tastes like coming right off the still, just lowered in proof to 40%. And the Buffalo Trace bourbon, which is a minimum 4-year age blend of bourbon. But you notice that they also make all sorts of other things out of that same recipe. Some of you may have had some of these other bourbons. And you may realize, well, that's strange, right? If it's the same recipe, right? If I made that same yellow cake box mix, right, on a couple different days, it should taste the same, right? Coming out. Like what's going on here? Right? The aging is where a lot of that differentiation can come in. And that's why all these products within each recipe will taste very different from each other. In much the same way, cognac has a few large producers that are blending. They have sometimes up to 150 to 200 years of history of creating these incredible grape distillates that they sit down and they blend together to make their different products, their different marks. And they're after a certain flavor profile in each case, right? With this, what they aim for is that every bottle of Paul Beau Hors tastes like the last one that you had. That style shouldn't change over time. And what they rely on is not just the minimum age brandy here of 30 years. I'm sure that's a large chunk of it, but you'll need a lot of older stuff behind it as well to make those slight adjustments, right? That's a great question. Can you overage something? Who thinks yes? Yeah. That was a resounding yes. Thanks, Jesse. Who thinks no? You can just keep going. I'd say it depends. You certainly can encounter things that have way too much wood influence, right? We had the opportunity to taste some very old tequilas the last time that I was down in Mexico. You'll notice that with a lot of tequilas, there's three major categories: Blanco, Reposado, and Añejo, and then there's extra Añejo now, I guess. But that maxes out at 3 years, right? So we were able to taste a 12-year, a 15-year, an 18-year, a 21, and a 25-year-old tequila. And at a certain age, you don't really get the character of the spirit anymore. It just tastes like an oak barrel. And for some people who really enjoy those flavors, they will really enjoy that spirit. But for others, I think like most of the people in this room, you want a little bit of what that started its life as. It works in concert with what's in that barrel, what those barrel flavors and aromas have contributed to it to make a really wonderful, really complex thing, right? Now, the other part of it is, why are American whiskeys not aged as long as some cognacs or some scotches or whatnot? Part of it is that you're using brand new barrels. Part of it is that these are charred, and these generally are not. With scotches, you're using used barrels, and those take a lot longer to develop the same sorts of aromas and flavors. And then on top of that, too, you have a very different climate. Climate has a lot to do with it, too. In Kentucky, it is hot in the summertime, and it's cool at night. And then it gets very cold in the winter as well. There's huge temperature swings all over the place. A lot of these warehouses are not climate controlled. So what you have are these huge temperature swings that are drawing whiskey into the barrel, into the staves, pushing it back out, drawing it in, pushing it back out, and it just makes this whole thing go a lot faster. In Europe, you have a much cooler, much more stable temperature range, right? It's still pretty high humidity, but it takes a lot longer for that barrel to breathe and interact. It just takes it's just a little slower. In the Caribbean, right, now you're hot and humid, and so that goes really fast, right? And same with down in Mexico too. You get a lot of sun down there, a lot of heat, and so you have some differences there too. And it differs in the way that these spirits interact, right, and change over time.